want to show you something rare. That's a Taiwanese flag flying outside an official embassy.
These handshakes are rare too. A gesture that says, I recognise you. There are only 12 places on the planet where this happens. These are the friends of Taiwan, small states caught up in a battle between superpowers.
Y por fin le agradecemos mucho el apoyo y la relación que ya tienen con Taiwán, también una democracia.
But Taiwan has been losing diplomatic allies as China chips away at Taipei's formal ties.
希望拉美和加勒比极少数国家认清历史大势，顺应民意。
And now which of Taiwan's friends heeds that Chinese call and which stick with Taipei is part of the barometer of power in an era-defining rivalry. So we're going to ask why some countries still back Taiwan, what those friends get from staying loyal, what it costs them, and whether Beijing will convince more countries to change course.
Plata teniendo relaciones con Taiwán.
Nosotros defendemos esta alianza con la República de China, Taiwán.
Hay muchos países que se cambiaron de bando, cortaron con Taiwán y se va con China, está arrepentidos.
To start this story, I'm taking you to Asunción, the capital of Paraguay. This landlocked country of around 7 million people doesn't often make global headlines, but here's why it stands out. This is the only South American country which recognises Taiwan.
There are signs of Taiwanese influence all over Asunción, and perhaps the biggest one of them is that building over there. It looks kind of like a spaceship. That's Paraguay's Congress, and it was refurbished recently thanks to Taiwanese funding.
Some of the buses here are painted in Taiwanese colours, and a few minutes' drive away, we even find this. A statue of Chiang Kai-shek, the man who lost China's civil war to the communists and fled to Taipei to set up a government in exile there, paving the way for modern-day Taiwanese democracy.
It says he dedicated his life to the fight for liberty, democracy, and the prosperity of China. Needless to say, Beijing has a very different take on this man's life. And this is signed by Alfredo Stroessner. That's Paraguay's former dictator. He was still in power when this statue was put in place in 1986.
After Mao Zedong established the Communist People's Republic of China, the PRC, in 1949, some countries began switching recognition to his government in Beijing. Let's look at how that played out over time. As the years rolled by, Beijing was on the up, lobbying hard for more international recognition and getting it. Dozens of states severed formal ties with the exiled government in Taiwan, which to this day calls itself the Republic of China. Then, after multiple attempts, the PRC in Beijing scored a major diplomatic win in 1971, when a United Nations vote gave it the Chinese seat at the world's diplomatic table. Another major turning point came in 1979. The United States switched its official recognition from Taipei to Beijing. From then on, the PRC's place on the global stage was firmly established, and having ties with it became mainstream. Its views on Taiwan haven't changed over the years.
世界上只有一个中国，台湾是中国的一部分，这是无法否认，也不容否认的历史和法理事实。台湾从来不是一个国家。 过去不是，今后更绝对不是。
Even though that's problematic for some of China's diplomatic partners, there are many reasons they maintain those ties, including this.
In trying to understand why the default position among the majority of countries around the world is having diplomatic ties with Beijing and not with Taipei, you'd very quickly land on economic and strategic considerations.
That's Chanel Dumoulin, my colleague who tracks global trade and geopolitics from the US.
If you need a comparison, 70% of the world trades more with China than it does with the US.
Let's go back to this map. Taiwan continued to hemorrhage diplomatic allies until 2008, when domestic politics there stopped the bleeding for a while.
There was a tacit truce when Ma Ying-jeou was the president of Taiwan. The Chinese government actually was approved of him to a very large extent.
That's Michael Cunningham. He's a senior fellow with the China program at the Stimson Center, a US-based think tank.
So that was between 2008 and 2016, and sort of to help his legitimacy in Taiwan, they didn't pick off any of Taiwan's diplomatic partners.
But ever since Taiwanese voters began electing less China-friendly governments,
several countries have switched recognition to Beijing, and it has been done in a very cinematic way that you could tell Beijing really controlled the timeline of these switches in a way to try to have the biggest possible impact on making the president and the ruling party look bad.
by 2026, Beijing was the clear winner in the global recognition race. Its diplomatic rise was meteoric.
Some of the recent high-profile flips include Panama, Nicaragua, Burkina Faso and Nauru.
As of 2026, just these 12 states maintain formal ties with Taiwan. They're scattered around the world, mainly in Latin America and the Caribbean and the Pacific.
Some of these states are so small or remote you might have trouble finding them on a map at first glance. And they don't have many people either, altogether just around 40 million. That's less than half of Germany's population. So why have these 12 states hung on against the odds? What's in it for them?
Taiwan has had to kind of play this game that they call dollar diplomacy for quite a few years, which is, you know, these countries are often smaller and require kind of development assistance and this sort of thing.
That's DW's East Asia correspondent Rick Glowert.
I think Taiwan has kind of changed its track over the last few years, and it's now really focusing kind of much more meaningful relations with these smaller countries.
Remember the Congress building and the buses in Paraguay? Well, that's not all. Taiwan is also pouring funds into a technology-focused university in Asunción, as well as digital health infrastructure. And the Taiwanese ambassador in Asunción has even bigger ideas for the future.
Paraguay tiene condiciones también para albergar un centro de datos de inteligencia artificial porque tiene abundancia, energía verde. Yo creo que será el próximo tema que vamos a estar muy interesados de trabajar con Paraguay. Yo creo que es el momento de demostrar también nuestra fidelidad y nuestra amistad hacia este pequeño amigo, pero muy fuerte y nunca se dejó presionar.
Santiago Peña, Paraguay's president, seemed pretty sure about his country's position when we met.
Creemos que el camino del progreso y del desarrollo es un camino largo que requiere más de las fortalezas internas que las dependencias externas, y esa es la razón por la cual políticamente nosotros defendemos esta alianza con la República de China, Taiwán.
So we know Taiwan has this shrinking circle of friends. Let's take a look at what it's doing to boost support to and from them.
There's also a really interesting a lady you can look it up, which is Taiwan's Vice President Xiaobi Kim. She described herself as a cat, because she needed to, when she was doing diplomacy in the US and around the world, she had to be like kind of feline and agile and squeeze into spaces.
Here she is squeezing into the European Parliament in 2025. It wasn't an official invitation from the institution that could breach the EU's One China policy. Instead, she was invited by an independent group of pro-Taiwan lawmakers, and that's a typical Taiwanese story. Let's hear what she said.
Democracies, even when far apart, are not alone. We are not alone in our values, we are not alone in our challenges, and most importantly, we are not alone in our responsibility to act.
Unofficial welcomes, coded language of friendship. But when it comes to Taipei's few on-the-record allies, it's a different story.
It's helpful for Taiwan as a country to demonstrate statehood. Taiwan's president can go on state visits to these countries. They also, especially the countries in Latin America and South America, they have a handy function that Taiwan often, when the president visits those countries, the president will do a stopover, do a layover in the US.
That's a tactic that Taiwanese presidents have used in the past. So the trip to America is not really a trip, just a refueling stop, with a few political meetings thrown in. Taiwan also relies on its allies to share its messages in spaces that it can't enter on its own, like the United Nations.
And Taiwan's been silenced. The 23 million people's voices have been kept unheard.
But Beijing wants to keep Taipei isolated, and it makes sure those who don't agree face consequences. let's go back to Paraguay. Because they're friends with Taiwan, you won't see any Chinese flags or an embassy here. Both Beijing and Taipei technically claim to be the legitimate government of all of China. Recognizing one means severing diplomatic ties with the other. Still, China is present here in other ways.
Todo China, todo se trae de ahí. Hay negocios que traen directamente de China nomás ya. Por container nos sale más barato acá.
But getting Paraguayan products to mainland China is more complicated.
China es el primer país del mundo en este momento en población, en tecnología, en comercio. Plata teniendo relaciones con Taiwán.
Milda Rivarola is a Paraguayan historian and former government minister who thinks her country has backed the wrong horse. Because China often imposes trade restrictions on countries which recognize Taiwan.
Pero es sencillamente la cortedad de miras de la clase política paraguaya de decir, bueno, acá tenemos un donante gratuito y lo único que tenemos que hacer es votar para que nos entre en la ONU, ¿verdad? Pero incluso ahora los agroexportadores están molestos porque el costo que tienen que pagar, el sobrecosto que tienen que pagar de vender commodities, no a China directo.
Agriculture dominates Paraguay's economy, and the bulk of the country's pork exports go to Taiwan. But when farming execs look for new customers, the world's biggest market is partially closed off.
Will be very good or very well business to work with China too. For us, will be very good if we will work with both.
But you can't.
Really, we can. We can, because we have the relationship with Taiwan.
And do you feel a bit caught in the middle of the politics there?
Maybe. Today we have the deal with Taiwan and we can to work with China directly.
Yeah. Directly, because indirectly it happens.
Maybe.
You can't say more.
I don't.
But Paraguay's president insists the business case makes sense. He told us he's done the math and made the right choice.
Hemos hecho múltiples estudios, tanto desde el sector público como el sector privado, y haciéndonos la pregunta, ¿Paraguay estaría mejor con un acuerdo de libre comercio con China popular o está mejor en este camino? Y los números son abrumadoramente superiores, mostrar el camino que hoy.
But China uses all sorts of other tactics to convince countries to change sides. There's the carrots. Take a look at this.
Before Burkina Faso ultimately switched recognition to Beijing, its ex-foreign minister told Bloomberg his country received Chinese offers worth $50 billion. And after Costa Rica switched in 2007, China gifted the country a new sports stadium.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan said Beijing had offered Paraguay millions of vaccine doses as the country struggled to cope with rising case numbers. China denied using vaccines to try and tempt Paraguay to ditch Taipei.
There are also bridges being built by China, literally and figuratively, via the Belt and Road Initiative, which has tied over 150 nations to China through roads, ports, some would say through debt, further cementing economic ties. Another reason China is also so important, especially to the US, is the chokehold they have on critical minerals. So China controls over 70% of the world's cobalt and lithium processing, and nearly all of the graphite supplies.
Then there's the sticks. Earlier this year, China announced tariff reductions on all African countries except one, tiny Eswatini. Why would China want to single out the 1.3 million people who live there? Well, it's one of Taiwan's 12 allies. China also makes it difficult for citizens from these states to visit. It's not hiding these tactics.
我也知道在场的有未建交国的朋友提出本国公民申请来华签证难问题，这也正说明个别国家同台湾当局保持所谓外交关系，不符合本国人民根本利益。
And its message is pretty consistent.
全世界183个国家同中国建交的事实充分证明，一个中国原则是国际大义，人心所向，大势所趋。希望拉美和加勒比极少数国家认清历史大势，顺应民意，早日加入承认一个中国原则的大家庭。
Beijing is also accused of meddling in the domestic affairs of Taiwan's allies in its bid to sway them.
China's also very good at kind of understanding how the local politics works, getting behind opposition parties if there's an election coming. And that is a concerted effort that Beijing will be continuing to do.
An investigation by news outlet Al Jazeera uncovered claims of businessmen allegedly backed by China paying bribes to Paraguayan politicians, something Beijing rejects. It's worth noting Taiwan's critics say it's the one that's been offering cash in exchange for political power.
Va repartiendo, poniendo un pan en cada canasta, ¿verdad? Eso en general es objeto de denuncia en el Senado. Pero es denuncia de yo no recibí esa cantidad, él recibió eso, entonces él es corrupto y yo no, ¿verdad? Porque todos reciben.
Yo le aseguro que nosotros no corrompemos a ningún político. Nosotros trabajamos con proyectos.
So we know both Beijing and Taipei are putting time, effort and funds into trying to sway these swing states of global power. But who else feels they have skin in the game here?
Take a listen to this. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio on a trip to Guatemala, one of the Taiwan 12.
Y por fin le agradecemos mucho el apoyo y la relación que ya tienen con Taiwán, también una democracia. No es fácil en un mundo donde hay mucha presión para cambiar ese reconocimiento, para romper esos enlaces, pero ustedes siempre se han mantenido firmes.
And why is the US so interested in Taiwan's friends? Well, let's take a look at the map.
Those that are in Latin America, in particular, are important to the U.S., largely because it views a country switching recognition to Beijing as that country cozying up to China.
And here are most of the others.
The Pacific is vast, there's only a few countries dotted around, and so they really take on this incredibly important strategic importance. So whoever has a foothold in these places, really, they're already looking to how what part they would play in any contingency, in any conflict in this region. And in some of these islands, you'll be seeing World War II runways that are now being revamped by the US. In other places, China is buying up land, putting, different facilities and stuff in place.
The US has a one China policy and only officially recognizes Beijing. Its policy on Taiwan is one of strategic ambiguity, not recognizing the island as a country, but not saying it wouldn't defend it either. This means the US has been able to lend some support to Taiwan without upsetting Beijing.
And it's adopted a range of its own tactics to help keep Taipei's allies on side.
Under the first Trump administration, the U.S. was mostly using sticks. So it was, recalling ambassadors from countries that switched recognition to Beijing. It was threatening to maybe suspend or cut off aid to countries that did this. And that wasn't a really effective way of going about it, because it's actual need that is causing a lot of these countries to want to turn to China in the first place.
As US-China rivalry heats up, things are shifting. 2020 US legislation said Washington should support Taiwan in strengthening its official diplomatic relationships. And now some US lawmakers are drawing up a bill to offer special funds for Taipei's allies.
Part of it is just looking at what is driving these countries to, what are the enticements or the pressure that Beijing is using to peel these countries away from Taiwan, and how can the U.S. step in and help provide some of the support that these countries need.
At the same time, US support for Taiwan is something of a moving target.
It's become even harder to tell what the U.S. would do in a Taiwan contingency. So remember, there had been this pledge in place since the 1980s that Washington would not consult Beijing about potential arms sales to Taiwan. But in February, President Trump did say that he had consulted with Chinese President Xi Jinping over the specific issue of arms sales to Taiwan. Then we heard about this $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan approved last year. being paused last May, possibly as a concession to China.
But the messaging is mixed.
So Trump, for example, said recently that he would be prepared to speak directly to Taiwan's president, which would be unusual and not really something that is done, and it is also something that would really annoy China. So where Taiwan fits into the US-China relationship is here too a bit of a moving target.
All this leaves Taipei's allies with a difficult line to walk domestically. Friendship with Taiwan is an alignment with the US, which isn't always popular in places like Paraguay.
De lo que no se mencionó, no hablamos todavía, es de la presión norteamericana, ¿no? Paraguay es un peón menor en su apoyo a Israel y a Taiwán, siempre.
And can you imagine a situation where Paraguay would change course?
Quizás si hay alternancia política, ¿verdad?
Paraguay's government says that's a non-starter. But what about the rest of the Taiwan 12? How firm is their friendship?
There are less countries left to take. There's only 12 now. And they also have kind of more specific situations that mean that not all of these countries will be as easy to switch allegiance to Beijing.
Squeezed by superpowers and watched by the world, Taiwan's friends face a choice each day. Here's a reminder of who's left.
So which state might Beijing try to flip next?
It won't be easy in the Pacific, where Taiwan's friends have security pacts with big democracies, including some with the US.
They remain sovereign territory, their own sovereign territory, but they have a kind of agreement that the US can use them in any ways that they want, and they're also, the US is responsible for their defense. Their population can go and live in the US. A lot of them serve in the US Army.
And what about in the West?
I'd say Haiti is dangerous right now because it needs so much economic and political backing. And because even when I lived in Taiwan over a decade ago, all my interaction with, or a lot of the interaction I had with Haitian diplomats led me to believe that many of them wished they were in Beijing.
But there's something even more interesting playing out in that region. A country gearing up to flip back.
Honduras switched to Beijing in 2023, but things didn't go to plan.
They do not feel like China has delivered. The shrimp industry in particular has just fallen apart since the switch happened.
Its president vowed to turn back to Taiwan during a 2025 election campaign, though has taken no concrete steps since. It wouldn't be the first time we've seen a country become a swing state in the Beijing-Taipei battle. All these countries have switched back and forth more than once.
But winning back a disappointed former partner like Honduras is about all Taipei can hope for. Experts say it's unlikely to formally win over any big new friends, given the risk that kind of move can incur.
There are some voices in the US, for example, that call for the US to establish diplomatic relations with Taiwan. First of all, Taipei, as far as I know, would not accept that because it does not want to fight a war. And the reason really being that Beijing would almost certainly see that as crossing its red line. Honduras is small enough. They're not so significant from Beijing's perspective that they're going to result in a major geopolitical problem that would result in war.
That's a clear signal, and Taiwan seems focused on forging ties in other ways.
Taiwan is a leader in semiconductors. They produce over 90% of the most advanced chips. So Taiwan's total trade crossed about 1.12 trillion last year. So that's a record and a sign of just how fast its economic footprint is growing. So while many countries don't recognize Taiwan, they're finding that they also can't really ignore it.
Taipei's informal friendships will remain its most crucial and controversial geopolitical ties for public opinion at home and its position on the global stage.
For many people, the unofficial dialogues, visits, delegations from other allies that aren't necessarily official diplomatic allies are more important.
This is where our story ends, but it's not the end of the road. Here's what we know. China will keep trying to chip away at Taiwan's shrinking network of allies. And Taipei will keep coming up with new strategies to try and convince them to stay loyal.
And this handful of small, often remote countries will maintain an outsized role on an ever more fragmented global chessboard. Because in the rivalry that defines this century, China versus the United States, these countries are something of a front line, not just pinpoints on a map where two sides vie for influence, but points to be scored or lost in a geopolitical battle with no end in sight.